I'm so excited to talk to you about your book, No Ashes in the Fire, Coming of Age, Black and Free in America. Folks, if you have not read this book or have not gotten a copy or donated a copy to somebody, I highly encourage you to do that. What does it feel like to just see me wave your book?
I call it the little book that could. It came out 5 years ago, 2018, and for it to still be a part of folks' conversations means a lot to me. Um, and I don't know, for some reason, you don't, I guess you ought to expect your words to sort of live, even if, beyond us. But it's nice to know that in 2023, I've had a few conversations this year so far with people centered around this book. And I'm just like, wow, 5 years later, what a blessing and encouraging for the work to come.
Mm. You are certainly still part of the conversation, and the book is absolutely relevant today. There's so many things that I want to talk to you about, but we'll start at home. We'll start where you grew up. Literally, Camden, New Jersey, where it all got started, 1976. So you do
Yes.
such a beautiful job painting a picture for us in the book about what that experience was like for you. But in your own words now, like, what was Camden, New Jersey like?
Camden was and remains very much it's the center of my personhood, of who I am, and not just my personhood, but it is the one of the lenses through which I see the world, and interpret people's relationships to me, my relationship to power, people's relationships to power, limited relationships, etc. It's very much like I'm very much like a diehard, like Camden proud fanatic, only because of the reality that it is a space like so many that I could name, Baltimore and Gary, Indiana. I can go down the line of like predominantly Black and or Latinx working poor, working class spaces that are imagined in the public domain as lacking vitality, as lacking like the type of profound cultural richness that adds to popular culture, to public conversation, to political movement, etc. And I'm often amazed because I'm like, there are so many amazing folk who have come out of Camden and amazing folk who are in places like Camden and Baltimore and Trenton and Newark, right? So I lift that up. Camden is, in many ways, I've had to train myself to see it as a place that is home to multitudes of love, like capacious love to this day. Like it's a city that's so small, densely populated, kind of, but so much so that people know each other's families by their last name. And it's sort of like you got these play cousins because people are just so intimately connected. And in so many ways, the city brings you together in that way. And at the very base of it, I do believe, like my politics and how I understand the world, this idea that one can't truly love if we are not, you talked about home, if we don't have enough space in our homes for people who need to be cared for, to be seen, to exist. Like I literally lived in a house full of family members. And
Right.
I think metaphorically, symbolically, what that was saying to me was, don't ever shut the door on people who need you, even if that means you got to sort of make yourself uncomfortable for a day or 2 years, right? By sleeping on the couch. I'm using this literally and metaphorically, right? To make sure that somebody else is good. And damn, if that's not like at the heart of the way that I live my life now. Now, there's some drawbacks to that.
Talk about it.
That one learns, but the balance there, that is to say, what is ours is literally ours. What is mine is ours. Is something that I learned at home. Something that I learned in Camden.
I think a lot of us are taught to hate the places we come from. Now, I happen to come from New York City. I grew up in New York City, and when I tell people that who are not from New York City, they say, "Wow, you were so lucky." Wow, you grew up like this, or you grew up like that. And people have these ideas about what it means to come from where you come from. And I love how you dispel in your book this idea that Camden was this rejected place, this despised place, right? And that's how it was portrayed in the media. I mean, even growing up in New York City, when we heard Camden, New Jersey, we all went like, oh, like that's
People are like, oh, you can fight.
oh, you can fight. Right. Right. We were like, oh, you can, okay, we ain't gonna mess with you. And, I love that you also don't shy away in the book about talking about environmental racism, and not just as redlining, but also pollutants and the quality of air, and how that was by design, right? By political strategy and design. And yet, living under those conditions, there was love, there was humanity, there was beauty, there was joy, there was storytelling. And so I'm interested in that paradox, because as a Black man, we live in a world of paradoxes. Now, being Black and queer, and being a Black man, or being Black and non-binary, right? All of these paradoxes we live in and we face. What did Camden teach you about living in paradox?
You are like unpacking. I mean, the title of the book, No Ashes in the Fire, is a reference, I think. No, not I think. It is a reference to a story that I tell. It's a reference to my own life, like a way to think about the way that I've come through trials, like they say in the church, tribulations, right?
And tribulations.
Touched but unscathed. It's also a reference to what it means to be Black in America. I often think about, I know I can go here with you because you would understand, like when I start giving like Kojic Black church references, like,
oh yeah,
the three Hebrew boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That story, and for those that are unaware in the Hebrew scriptures, is really illuminating what it means to be surviving through conditions of seeming impossibility. And here you have these three who are in a burning furnace, but they are yet surviving. And I'm like, okay, we can preach with this metaphor. No, isn't that what it means to sort of be Black in a country that we are still living in, as Saidiya Hartman would say, right, in the afterlife of slavery? What it means to grow up and to try to survive and love oneself in the wake, as Christina Sharp would say, right, of like being taught that your Blackness, that your queerness, that your difference is either sinful, provocation for hell, or just downright ought to be legislated against. But to be able to see you today and to have smiles on our faces in the midst of those conditions is very much akin to what it means to be living, surviving through a fiery furnace. So what I think it's saying is that it is very possible that we wake up every day having to fight all of the machinations that come our way, whether that's queer antagonism, whether that is sort of legislation against one's identity because of somebody's skewed old school understanding of gender, whether that is, ableism or whatever the thing is. It is possible that we can find smiles, that we can find love, that we can sort of nurture community in the midst of all of that shit and make good, something good in the midst of it. And that for me is what my life has been like, what it feels like to be brought up in a space like Camden, what it feels like to grow up in a family that didn't have access to a lot of quote unquote things, material things, but had access to unfathomable amounts of love for one another. And that's also what it means to be Black and queer, to be a Black, queer, male-identified person in both a nation state and trapped often within ideologies that had often tried to snatch that good life away from me.
We're going to get to some of those ideologies. You talk about them in your book. You just brought up your family. By the way, you was a cussing preacher.
Oh,
Uh,
I'm sorry, y'all.
no, it's fine. That's what in my household we call it Baptist. No shade,
Oh no,
but
I only did Baptist stints. I'm really holiness Pentecostal.
okay, I see. Amen. Let the church say
Well,
yes.
yeah, they didn't cuss. They didn't necessarily cut in the pulpit, but they was cussing at
Okay,
home
they was
and outside.
cussing.
Done. Period. Okay. Don't,
You
that's a whole
know,
nother episode.
oh, that's a whole nother episode. We'll have you back for that one gladly. I want you to talk about. I know this is a difficult subject based on what I've read and having my own understandings and interpretations of my relationship to my father and my relationship to other Black men. I want to preface the question by saying that our fathers, the relationships we build with them are sort of the templates that instruct us for new relationships with Black men.
Lord.
And let's just sit in that for a second. And so when that relationship is disrupted, when it is chaotic, when there's trauma, when it's complicated, right?
Yeah.
That leaves an impression upon you that you then carry with you. And in your book, you talk about your dad. I love the story you share in like page 45 of the book where you're talking about your father bathing you, being in the shower with you, and that tender moment. And then later in the book, you also talk about witnessing domestic violence in your house at the hands of your father. And so this, again, paradox of violence and from the same hands that violence came from also was this tenderness, right? So, and my condolences to you and your family. I know you lost your father before the book was released, and you had an opportunity to sort of sit with your understandings of him post his death. So there's a few ways we could go about this, but what was your relationship like with your dad? And
Yes.
what impression did that leave upon you about manhood?
Such a great question. I'm actually going to read a paragraph or two from this piece that I wrote. And I don't know when this was published, but um, it was titled following, of course, like Joseph Beam and some others who have uttered this Black men loving Black men is a revolutionary act.
Yes.
But the first paragraphs, the first Black man I loved wasn't an accumulation of white America's long held fears. No Black man could ever live up to that. He was a body, a human. He was not America's fabled, monstrous buck, nor was he an icon of meritocracy. He was my father. I was his son. He was a Black man whose belly sometimes protruded far beyond his waistline, who spoke in a poetic vernacular that allowed him to communicate in code to the people he encountered on the streets of our Black hood in New Jersey, his words holding different meanings to those inside and outside the community. His hands were sometimes scaly and calloused from too much physical labor performed by little pay when he could land jobs, who split time between U.S. prisons and a rental home in Camden made him something of an absence to be derided and desired. He was not always the best at showing care, but when he did, his care was generous. He was not always aware of others' plights to render him invisible, and sometimes he did a good job of discarding himself. He held me in the same hands that were often used to hurt my mother. The beatings he meted out, like the time he twisted my mom's arm until she cried in my presence when I was a boy because she talked back, were common. But he was the first Black man who loved me, and I loved him back. Had he been an imperfect white man, because all men are imperfect, the world may have loved him still. If he were an abusive white man like Donald Trump, who came from generational wealth, with wealth that means power, he would have been afforded visibility and acclaim. Had he been a white man who failed as much as he excelled, he would have been deemed worthy of love. He might be alive at 55 and not dead too young from heart complications. Any heart that beats overtime to compensate for what it is denied is one to break too soon. Last sentence I'll read. The fact of America is that Black people's lives and mistakes are individual and collective. The fault always of the man and never the world around him. But those faults are used to pathologize not just the man, but those who look like him too. In my mirror, I saw fault. Okay.
Ooh.
As you started talking like that, instantly that passages came to mind, partly because of this work I tried to do in the book specifically and in my life, both on the page and in my heart and in my mind, trying to reconcile the idyllic father image that I was aspiring after, the one that I wanted him to sort of be,
Yeah.
versus the complex, human, realistic version of a self that he was. That he was both violent, use those hands to do violence and use those hands to do beauty, I think says a lot about his complex humanity. I am my father's child in that, in many ways, I was taught to, it was easy to despise him and easy to hate him and be angry and to use him as the target upon which I stuck all of my pins of resentment. Like, because I was like, as long as I'm not like him, I'm not out here beating women, I'm not out here selling drugs, that I could hold him up in my mind as a sort of like uh, idea monster,
Mm,
which in many ways made me feel better about myself. Huh.
sure.
Until I was sitting down and reckoning on the page with the reality that the same stuff that he took in, the same air of male dominance, the same ideas about male, power over femme, over women, um, patriarchal ideas like that men should be at the center of the home, at the center of the world, at the center of the office, running things, was the
Mm,
same stuff I believed. We were no different in what we grounded our understanding of ourselves in. And it wasn't until he died, until I was trying to write about him on the page, that I had to close the distance between him and myself, which I call love. I think love is removing the distance that exists between us and another. Um, so in many ways, I would also say that I've been a young boy most of my adult male life, striving to heal from the version of the sort of maybe 6-year-old boy that was left back in 1982, waiting for daddy to come home, always suffering from this idea that people would leave me and abandon me, having abandonment issues, always not really believing that people's love was real. Like if somebody showed up in my life as a friend,
mm.
as an institution, I'm like, they're going to leave me first. So I would disrupt the relationship and leave. I mean, I can go down the line of how that little boy was still floating around in his 40-something-year-old body, his 40-something-year-old spirit, all because of daddy issues. And I still, to this day, with all this gray in my beard, right, have to make sure that I'm confronting that little boy and reminding him that everybody's not showing up like your daddy, and that you deserve to heal from that version of yourself. And the tactics that you use worked then probably, but they may not work for you now.
Wow. I know that so many people who will hear this are going to resonate. That's going to resonate with, because I mean, what you say is so true, right? This idea that we can go on years and years and years and still that little boy, right, that's inside of us is yearning for relationship with daddy, that is still broken and impacted by it. And I mean, how did you begin to break those cycles? I think it's one thing to know that you've gone through the worst, but how does one begin to do the work of healing their inner child?
I'll say a few things. One is writing saved my life. You know, K.S.A. Lehman, a celebrated writer, talks about the process and work of revision.
Hmm.
And as a writer, you think about what that might mean to constantly go back to the page and start over and trash some stuff and come back to it again and say, I need to do this again, even a perfect sentence. Let's look at it again. And in so many ways, both on the page, the work of sort of having to tell the truth about oneself on the page was a healing modality for me. Like I was
Mm.
healed writing. It's most of these things, like in that book and other writings I've done, it's not stuff that you typically would be talking about. Like I would be talking about in public. You know what I'm saying? Mental health,
Right.
trauma, and there's something to be said though about unleashing what we're told to hide. And when we hide it, this is where I think the problems become even more critical for us. There's something about saying, like, opening a door up, like, here's the door that, like, I'm opening a closet door up. Look at all this that I'm
Yeah.
having to wade through, and I'm not hiding from it. So that's number one, writing. Two, a community of people that I could be honest with. Um, I don't know why with y'all want to use church references, but this idea that you walk in a church house and be like, how you doing? I'm blessed and highly favored. I can't tell you how many times I lied. I walked in some churches not literally not wanting to be on this earth, wanting to be in God's like some imagined heaven, and was never able to really tell the people who were supposed to be in charge of my care, the care of my soul, of the most honest aspects of myself. And in so many ways, like I feel like that's what it means to sort of be like Americanized, right? Like to sort of like Western to come into these spaces and just to have avatars of itself, both
Mm.
on social media and in real life. And so in so many ways, I think the second thing I'll say is community that allowed me to get rid of that avatar and to say when I'm hurting and to say, I'm not feeling well. I'm not okay. And third is, um, I went to school to get a degree in clinical counseling and ended up going to be saved. Like I literally did that before I went to seminary and did 4 years of part-time study for a program that really saved my life. So I will also say that therapeutic and other healing modalities are critical and necessary. I have a therapist now. Um, And I'm grateful for every moment I get to spend sitting across from somebody who can create space for me to look back at that little boy, to look back at my schemas, the things that I sort of put into play to survive that don't necessarily serve me well. They are not bad. Many of us have employed things to be exactly where we're supposed to be, but we don't always have to carry those things with us in the future. So to have somebody that can challenge me about that has been a blessing.
Right. Wow. You say on page 61 of No Ashes in the Fire, you say, holding on to painful secrets feeds on the heart like a cancer. Every attempt at blocking out the memories, every act committed to anesthetize. Is that how we say this word?
Say
Anes-
it. You can say it though, like anesthesia, like
like
anesthetize.
anesthesia, the pain. Big words, my friend. Big words. You say, when I was
Anesthetize.
12, anesthetize the pain was useless. When I was 12, I threatened to jump from the bedroom window in our house. My sisters cried out for me to stop. In school, I poured every ounce of energy I possessed into my schoolwork and after school activities. At home, you say, I got lost in my dreams and fantasized about life without a woman beating father. And on the streets, I slowly took on a hard demeanor, losing smiles and compassion, vowing to hurt anyone before they hurt me. The only way cancers can be stopped is by acknowledging their existence and doing what you can to treat them. And sometimes relief comes when the source of the problem is removed. And I think that you're absolutely right. The writing piece, when I was reading this, I thought, oh my God, I got to sit and write my story, because
Mm,
the healing I felt through the pages of reading and witnessing your story gave me a liberation that I was searching for.
mm,
And that is the power that your words have. That is why 5 years later, we're still talking about this book, because we are still healing and the word is alive, it's active. And that is so powerful. And to be able to sit with family members, with people you love, who've hurt you, who've done you wrong, to confess. I mean, there's so much of that in this book. There's confession, there's asking for forgiveness, there's giving yourself forgiveness, there's reconciliation. There's not just saying I was harmed, but also saying I've done harm too, right? Like I've done the thing that was wrong, and that you lay it out in such a human way, an approachable way, that I think is notable. It's noteworthy for all of us that our healing can begin not just when we tell our secrets, but also when we own the parts of our story that are hard to own. And that's what you've done.
Oh, well, I thank you for that. And it is, I always say that memoir is a tricky genre, um, because in many ways, for me as a writer, I imagine it as either needing to sort of write myself in the book as like a hero or the villain.
Mm,
But life is much more complex than that. Um, and part of what I was adamant about is telling the truth, and to do what, like, the hard work of reckoning with self. Like, there's no way that I'm going to sit up here and, like I said, and be like, oh, my dad was horrible, 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 horrible. And not talk about the fact, there was one time that I'm arguing with my partner and I swung at him. Like, how can I write that? Like, how can I write
yeah,
about, and, like, harangue my dad? Who, by the way, like, I'm not saying doesn't need to be held accountable, but like not hold myself accountable.
right.
Um, you know what I mean? And I wrote that story, and it took a lot of courage to say, like, like, particularly when I want to walk around and be an avatar. Like, I want to using words like black feminism for everybody. And I'm like, whoa, if it is for everybody, like, part of what your healing is going to come from is honesty. Like, don't get out here on Front Street and write about, um, domestic abuse and not talk about this time you swung at somebody. Now, thank God I didn't hit him. I remember
Yeah.
crying at the very moment it happened, because I was crying, yes, because I, in a second, that quick, went from like some loving a person to forgetting about that love in that moment, right? And I cried because I came face to face with the very object of my derision. Like I said, like, that's when I was like, oh, like, you have hated your father for
Mm,
this thing that you just did. And I was, like, devastated that, um, I put my partner at the time through that. Um, and so, like, I use that as an example to say, like, we can't heal, if, one, we don't give ourselves permission to name the ways that, yes, we are broken, but also the ways that we have broken other people. But that also, like, in order for us to be able to do that, there has to be an environment that creates the conditions for us to do that. I mean, we also live in a world today where, as much as we want people to be healed and transformed, I don't know if we have the capacity for care that will
mm,
allow people to be as honest as they probably need to be in order to get the type of healing they want. As much as we say we want, um, everything from rape culture to, the killing of our trans family, and trans folk, like, queer, and like, I can go down the line with the things that we need to stop, like racism. If folk are out here faking the funk, like, if I'm out here faking the funk as a queer person, acting as if I got it down to a T when it comes to my understanding. I'm just saying it, like, of gender as an example,
right.
and not giving a type of space, one, where I'm not doing harm by either asking questions or talking about these things. I don't know if we can heal. So I often wonder what would those conditions look like where we hold people to account with what we call, like, costly grace, or, as Aisha Shahida Simmons, she talks about love with accountability. Um, like, if I think that there is a world in which that exists, that is more liberatory for, say, Black men to be freed up from all of the things that harm us and harm other people, like all the things that we put our faith in. What's the best way to make that happen? You know, in my book, I talk about, these boys who attack me and me not wanting them to go to jail, and they attack me because of my perceived gender, presentation. Like I didn't know if I was gay at the time, but they saw a boy who acted too much like what they understood a girl to act like, and attacked me for that. And the way I say it is like a jail cell. What is that going to do? Is that going to make a jail cell? Is that going to stop making them be any less homophobic or any less fearful of the femme? I don't think so.
Yeah.
So this is the question I'm getting at, right? What are the containers? What are the mechanisms that we need to help people to actually facilitate the change? And and it's particularly in a moment where so much of the work is like abolition, we are throwing a lot of people in jail cells instead of like finding new modalities. And I'm using that in air quotes here, not necessarily, well, in some ways, physical jail cells, but also like these sort of metaphorical ones. I don't believe that sending them young boys to jail would have helped. I do believe that fostering them and circling them with people who could help them think differently about themselves, about who they are in the world, about who we are as human persons outside of the guise of manhood and womanhood, how we ought to love our bodies, and etc., is helpful. Not putting cuffs around them. And if I use that as a way to think about the questions I'm posing back, like what's possible for us? What can we do to facilitate spaces where people can be honest in such a way that they're seeking healing? Seeking is imperative there. Now, you can't really help people that don't want it.
Right.
But for folk who are seeking healing and who want accountability, what spaces can we create that might facilitate that?
And I think that you are providing some of that answer in kind of what you just said, that that these containers can exist that will allow for people to have that system of love and accountability. And, I that's why I wanted to do this show. That's why this was important to me to create this platform, because we can not only talk about abolition and transformation and decolonization or any of these other terms that we throw out, and especially in academia, without also saying, well, but what are the spaces and what are the institutions and what are the places that we can access this? And this is the beginning of that work and having these conversations. And I think in Black community, we look at the church as being that place in some ways. And like you, my own relationship with the church has been very complicated, in that while it could be a place of healing, it also has been a place of harm and damage. And you talk about this in your story, this turning to God, turning to Christ, turning to the church as a way to heal yourself, but also as a way to deny yourself, right? Also as a way of sort of putting up this wall between you and the mirror, because it was too painful to look in the mirror. So rather than look at the mirror, I'll just look at this deity idea of God. And you break through a lot of that, right? You break through some of that. Well, what church was meant to do, the institution, the community, right, was meant to do for you, unfortunately didn't have the capacity, weren't equipped to deliver that kind of healing for you. And so you had to pursue it in new ways. And also the hypocrisy, right? Like the hypocrisy of you holding people to a standard that then behind closed doors were living a whole other life. And that's what happens, right? You also talk about shame and secrecy and silencing, but that's what happens when you're not allowed to say, this is who I am, and not get judged for it, right? Or say, this is what I love. This is what I want to overcome, and be led through with grace into a better and more healed place. And it doesn't mean that you have to let go of all of who you are, but it does mean that you have to acknowledge that maybe some of who you are is creating harm. And that's exactly what you're doing through your work.
First of all, it's not Sunday, but you just preached over me. I really did I tried to model that this sort of ethic of self-reflexive analysis, self-reflexive, like the way to get through healing is also by sort of like, like I always say this everywhere I go, but like we've been taught to name the feet that are on our necks, but not really name the necks that our feet are on. And
Wow.
it's that second part that's really the radical work. You know what I mean? So I tried to use the book as a model of what that could look like, that sort of pair duality. But let me just say this too. I mean, thinking about like Blackness and Black manhood and mental health, and like, we can't have a conversation without naming the church. And let me be clear. I want to talk about, Dolores Williams. I want to make sure I'm citing the people. She would refer to Black churches as African American denominational churches. I don't want to make a claim that any church where there's predominantly Black people, that we might call a Black church, buys into what I'm about to say. And yet, right? I want to be clear that there are, and let me lift up the African American denominational churches, the Black churches that have been repositories of care for me, that I found sometimes maybe not too later in my journey. But for the most part, many of the churches I've come through, whether they were holiness churches, I'm not going to name them here, the Apostolic Church I was baptized in Philly, the Church of God in Christ, church of which I was a member in Newark, where I loved my bishop and he loved me too. But, again, it was connected to some dogmatic ideas that he had nothing to do with, that frustrated, my becoming and who I was. I can go down a line, like the non-denominational church that loved my singing and loved the work that I did with the young people and the curriculums that I wrote and the preaching that I did and the money that I gave and the shouting that I did not allow me to be fully human, fully who I am. I mean, so much of my psychological malaise, so much of my distress, my mental health, like distress, came from the theological violence that was inflicted on me and others within the church space. I was seeking out of here. Think about this. You go to church. I mean, the theology sort of works itself right on out, where you're almost taught to believe, and I understand why. And James Cone talks about this, theologian, right? Like Black theology sort of tended to be, in some threads of it, this idea like strive for heaven. Because, this earth here that we have, which is so ripe with like all of the things that, are antagonistic to us as Black people, racism being one, right? We got a golden throne, a golden mansion up in heaven that's waiting for us, right? So the idea that we ought to sort of get out of here. And in order to get, by the way, in order to get there, you damn sure better sort of follow the law to the T in order to get there. So it's already a prevalent theology in that way, that, this earth that you're living in is just not a good house for the Black body, for the Black person. And you pair that with like queerness, this, where I was in churches where I was prayed on and had hands put on me and, I'm on the ground, spit coming out my mouth, psychological traumatic responses to real-time theological violence is happening to me, and me going home believing that whatever witchcraft I'm carrying or whatever spirit is in me or whatever demonic presence is, is sort of like lingering every time I think about another man, is my cross to bear. And damn sure the only way I thought I could get out of it is if I killed the body.
Wow.
And, I'm like, the reality, and I have to say, like, when I got into, and I went to it was an Eastern university, which is a Christian university. I went to get a counseling degree there. Interestingly enough, And the DSM-4, the Diagnostical Statistical Manual, where you look to sort of see all of like the, is that major depression, all these things. I'm like, there should be a line in here that talks about like theologically induced, masochistic, sort of like trauma.
For sure.
Because so much of my depression, so much of my ideation with suicide had everything to do with what I had been taught to believe about myself via the folk who stood in those pulpits and preached me into hell, somebody's imagined hell. I'll stop here by saying, I wrote this piece for Ebony magazine that one of my friends, he laughs to this day about this, but he was a laughing then. It was called "I'd Rather Go to Hell for Telling the Truth." And pretty much the argument was, and I told him, he's like, "Aren't you scared you're going to go to hell?" When I told him that I was, I'm like, I am accepting who I am. I looked in the mirror. God is good with me. End of discussion. Period. And he said, "Well, aren't you scared you're going to hell?" And I said, you know what? Logically, if hell is a place that you're sending all of the folk, at least in my estimation, that have been honest about themselves, I think I'd rather be there than a place where the folk who are seemingly lying about themselves are going, namely heaven. That don't make logical sense to me. Not even spiritual theological sense. I don't want to be nowhere where there are a bunch of people who have lied about the very persons that they are. And that moment was a breaking point, honestly, in like my healing. Like to be able to own and take power over the very theological systems that had encroached. Like, I mean, they were trapping me. To be able to say like, oh, wait, I'm actually in the matrix. And I just discovered, baby, I can move this thing around. And I was like, actually, like, I've been serving y'all God, not mine. Yeah. It's a God y'all created. Not that, and I don't have to serve that God. I don't have to, worship a God who you are telling me hates me, that God's creation. No. Like that moment, thank goodness I actually loved my seminary experience because it gave me space to wrestle. It gave me space to ask questions when I was taught not to, and then I had a seminary, we have to do like, a year working at a church. And I decided that I'm like, I don't want to go to any black churches. I done did this all my life. Y'all done tore me up, namely. And then we got a problem with white churches too. Don't get me started there. But my pastor, Daniel Meter, who was my supervisor, took me for a walk. And he said, "I want you to say, I'm gay and God loves me." Now, mind you, I'm like, I'm telling you, I was like a church. And I said, "What?" He said, "I want you to say, I'm gay and God loves me."
Wow.
When I tell you it took every bit of courage for me to say those words, and I said it. And I said it.
Did you believe it?
I think the repeating of it made me believe it. But he said, "I need you to like believe it. Say it until you believe it." How many people's healing,
oh my goodness,
are sort of right there in front of their nose,
right?
Or sort of like clouded because of some awful violent theology that is haunting them right now. Like I mean, if anything, like I hope somebody's listening to this and knows, like your healing really. And I tell people, and I'm not want to tell people to leave your church community. I know what it feels like to leave the people that you call. I left a church of like 10,000 members, right? Like that I was intricately involved with, and knows what it feels like to have left that place. But I tell you what, never in my entire life have I felt as free, as okay looking in the mirror, with less anxiety, with less prayers to somebody's God for deliverance from the very thing that God had created me to be. I would never go back
Mm,
to that torture chamber of a space. And just, hope, like, if there's somebody listening, like, there are other ways that we can be. And this is not just beyond the church, but
right.
if there are ways of being that we're trapped in, that aren't good for us, we can get free from it.
Darnell, I want you to repeat and complete these as we wrap up. I'm going to offer these phrases and then I want you to fill them in. I am
here.
Black love is
Black love is rich, in a gift, because to love the thing, Blackness, that you've been taught to hate, is the ultimate testament of love.
Black boys need
Black boys need I'm going to say this word miracles, but I don't mean it in a way that we've come to think about. I mean, like, every day, the everyday miracle of, like, people showing up, strangers, institutions, in with material love for Black boys.
And this last one, Black masculinity is
Black masculinity is one texture of a personhood that one could sort of like take on, but it's just only one. It's just one.
And I'll add this one. Black healing is
Black healing is necessary for a remaking and a redoing of this world.
And Darnell Moore, you are doing that healing work for yourself, for us. I'm sitting here tearing up because the truth of your story gives us permission to see ourselves and gives us permission to dare ourselves to be free. And because you've dared that and you've lived that, we now have the courage to dare our own selves to be free. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this. It's like the best way to describe it is like a sweet. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Darnell Moore, everybody.